and welcome back. This is Professor Hall, and today we are going to talk about Jane Eyre. I'm so excited. This is one of my favorite books, and I love the the picture here from the movie poster because I feel like it captures the book a lot better than what may or may not be your book cover. Sometimes the book covers make the book look so boring, and this book really isn't. So today in our summary, what we're going to do is talk just about really the beginning part of the book, and that is because I don't want you to have spoilers. So a note about spoilers: I'm going to ask that you, if you're in my class, that you don't look up anything about the book before you read it. So I'm providing you materials that you can understand the text, and we have these lectures. The summary is going to help you understand the context of the novel, the beginning part of it. And this is going to be really important just to kind of know what to expect for the first few chapters, and then hopefully you can be drawn in by the story and it can kind of carry you through. I'm going to have a similar warning when we talk about Rebecca. If you're in my class where we're doing that this semester, if I change my mind later, we may not. But if you're reading Rebecca with me as well, that's a book that is also a mystery. So this novel is part mystery, and if you look up the ending or try to read a full summary online, it's going to ruin the mystery for you. So if you're not in my class, and if you are, either way, I do have another lecture about the ending, but I'd like you to save that until after you've read the book. So this is the summary just of basically up to chapter 23, and then the second video for later on is chapters 23 through 38, which looks at the last portion of the novel. But if you don't do this, I guarantee you won't like the book as much. And I want you really to discover the story for the first time. The way you might have read it before the internet was there to tell you every little twist and turn that happened. And some of you are looking up the ending as I'm saying this, but please don't. Don't do it. All right. So chapters 1 and 2, meet our heroine. Jane is a bright but very plain orphan, and she is telling the story from her perspective. She emphasizes how plain she is, meaning that she's not pretty. So she lives at Gateshead with her aunt, uncle, and cousins. They are called the Reeds, and she's cared for by Bessie, a nursemaid, who's a little bit sympathetic to the girl's plight, but really Bessie works for her Aunt Reed and can't really help Jane all that much. At the opening of the novel, Jane's uncle, who's kind of been her protector, Mr. Reed, has died. His wife is rather cruel to Jane, forbidding her to play with her 3 cousins, Eliza, Georgiana, and John. John, in particular, bullies and tortures her. Eliza and Georgiana are often at odds, so they're often fighting and quarreling, and they don't say very nice things about Jane either. After one of these bullying incidents, Jane is sent to the Red Room where her uncle died, which she believes to be haunted. So the scene of the Red Room, it's not that long, but a lot of scholars talk about it at length. The reason for that is that it shows quite a bit some of the themes of the book that we're going to get into later, but there's issues here of gender, that she's bullied more because she's a girl. And John is stronger than her. He expects to be smarter than her. You can see her pictured here in one of the film versions reading. And the idea of women being confined to a certain place during that time, as well as this gothic tone that we're going to talk more about later on. And there are strange noises and mysterious things going on. And although there's not really anything mysterious necessarily at Gateshead, this Red Room incident does set that up. So be sure to watch for that at the beginning part of the book. There's also issues of class, that Jane, as an orphan, doesn't have any money. And if she did, she certainly would not be treated like this by her relations. They would be kind of sucking up to her to get her money later on. So all of those things are going on at the beginning of the book. Chapters 3 and 4, very puritanical sign on young Jane here from a different film version. Mr. Brocklehurst. So after Jane's in the Red Room, Bessie and the family doctor, he's called an apothecary, but it would be like sort of a pharmacist, Mr. Lloyd, they care for Jane after she comes out. And Lloyd talks with Jane and really does seem to actually be the first person to listen to her. He sees that she's unhappy, that she's neglected. This is a form of child abuse. So he recommends that she go to school because he thinks it would be good for her. And it's kind of a benefit to her aunt, who can get rid of her and get her out of the way and never have to look at her again. But it really is meant to benefit Jane as well. So we learn then about Jane's history, how her parents met and married and eventually died. I want you to watch for that section because Jane's own courtship later on is going to look quite a bit different. So what we have here is an example of people who had a love match and were getting married for the right reasons. A few months later, after all these incidents, Mr. Brocklehurst of Lowood School comes to question Jane to see if she should be admitted into his institution. He's a very hard and cruel man. He's very cheap also, which is going to come into play later. And he decides basically that all of these horrible things that Mrs. Reed is saying about Jane are true, and he's going to punish her for them when she starts at the school by basically embarrassing her and chastising her in front of all of her teachers and all of the other students. Jane is, you can see the picture here again, chastised in front of everyone at school, and it causes her a lot of embarrassment and shame. And while she is mourning this, she finds solace in a friend, Helen, and also in one of the teachers and the leader of the school, Miss Temple. So when she also finds that no one likes Mr. Brocklehurst and that really he's mean to everyone. But what I want you to watch for here are, early formations of opinions about religion, about spirituality, about faith, about teaching and being taught, and also how Jane's very stubborn and passionate spirit is kind of quieted by love in her life, by having these people who actually love her and care about her. So she is quite a strong female character. And I don't mean that she's softened in the way that she loses strength, but I think she finds or comes to find eventually as she grows older a different type of strength. Chapters 5 through 10, here's one of the early versions of Jane Eyre. All of the girls in their pinafores waiting breakfast. So at Lowood School, as I said, she finds comfort with some of her teachers, particularly Miss Temple and Helen Burns, who Jane regards almost as an angel. And that terminology, looking at Helen as an angel or a saint, is going to be quite prominent there. So before that point, Jane really only knew the harsh law of religion, people saying, things to her about how she was going against God and things like that. But Miss Temple really shows her grace, and the love of God is also shown through Helen, who has a very sweet but strong faith. So they teach Jane about the importance of things such as honesty and humility. And these influences are really in contrast to Mr. Brocklehurst's hypocrisy. And as I said, they soften Jane's sort of rebellious spirit because that's what love does. So because of the harsh conditions at Lowood, and I picked this picture for a reason, You can see the empty bowls. They're waiting to just slop some gruel into them, which is like a thin cornmeal and water, sometimes oats and water. They have threadbare clothes, and the school becomes a breeding ground for typhus. Many of the girls die, though Jane remains healthy. But it really shows the difference, of how these girls are treated because of their gender and because of their social class. The school, because of the typhus outbreak, is taken over from Mr. Brocklehurst, and life improves for Jane and Miss Temple and her friends. So in chapter 10, we get a summary of the next 8 years. So we kind of fast forward. I kind of tend to think that the author realized how much time had been taken up by Jane's young life, and she really wanted to get to the romance part. And so anyway, she has this chapter that is like a flash forward, where we get the rest of Jane's studies at Lowood, and then she also spends 2 years teaching there. So by the time she leaves, she is 19. And then we come to Thornfield. So when Jane is 19, Miss Temple decides to marry. And when she leaves, Jane feels like the school is no longer really the home that she had found there before. So she advertises for work, and she finds a job as a governess to Adele, an 8-year-old French girl who lives at Thornfield Hall as the ward of Mr. Edward Fairfax Rochester. So a governess is a type of position where a woman would be employed to teach children at a private home. These children would have had a nursemaid when they were very young, and so they kind of are old enough to not have a nanny, right? But oftentimes they were quite privileged, so instead of going to school, a teacher would be brought to them. And a governess would live at the home, but really wouldn't be part of the family, because she usually was a genteel or a well-bred woman with good education, but not money. So at the same time, she was higher up than the servants, who were kind of a lower class. So Jane is in this weird kind of middle position, and we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. But I just to have some context, that's what she is there to do, to teach Adele. So Jane makes friends, becomes friends with the housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, and she enjoys teaching Adele, but the girl is kind of spoiled and a little bit silly at times. It's said because she's French, so watch for that, because there are a lot of dispersions against the French and holding up British people as kind of having better virtues. Rochester is dark and stern, but he and Jane enjoy witty conversation. That can be a tad bit hard to follow, but basically know that he's kind of flirting with her when they first meet a little bit, and she doesn't fully understand that he's flirting with her. But they have this very witty conversation. Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, is there and doesn't understand what they're talking about. Doesn't really get that they're kind of testing the waters a little bit because they find each other attractive, but she says that he's not handsome, and he is plain, as she is as well. She's like, objectively, people would not find you handsome, but she comes to sort of see him as handsome because she likes him. But at any rate, they form a friendship first, and as their friendship deepens, Rochester tells Jane more about his dark past, including his past love affairs. So we find out a little bit more about why he has Adele living with him. We find out a little bit more about his life before he kind of settled down. So his running about years, as it were, when he was in his 20s and 30s sowing his wild oats. He's about 40 at this point. So Jane enjoys his company and loves teaching Adele, but she's troubled by noises she hears in the night, and there's disturbing events, some of which are attributed to a mysterious servant, Grace Poole. So the mystery kind of begins at Thornfield. It's foreshadowed a tiny bit with the Red Room at the beginning of the book, but as Jane goes on, there are sunny days, but very dark, mysterious nights. So the rest. Rochester leaves for a short time. Jane realizes how much she feels for him. When he returns, he brings guests with him, which makes Jane feel kind of isolated and alone. Again, realizing that she's fallen in love with her employer. After another short period, Jane goes back to Gateshead. So watch for when that happens. I've had people before get kind of confused about what's going on, but essentially she is summoned to go back to Gateshead to attend her Aunt Reed. So we find out what happened to Georgiana and Eliza and John in this long period since Jane has left them. Mrs. Reed admits that Jane has other relatives, and later on, Jane will meet some cousins from that side of the family who've been looking for her for some time. But the other stuff that I don't want to get into, there are fortune tellers, there are fires, there are bad omens, visions, coincidences, madness, journeys into the night, and other twists and turns. And there are secrets and mysteries, so I'd like you to let them be secrets and mysteries until they're revealed. The book is longer, but not all classics are boring, and I really hope that you will enjoy it. I think that the people who have found it boring are the people who have looked things up about the book, and then of course it's boring because you know what's coming. So, so I hope you enjoy it. So let's talk about other characters to remember. We have Mrs. Reed, who I mentioned. I may also give you guys a character sheet just so you can kind of keep people straight. There are a number of names here to throw out. So Mrs. Reed, Jane's cold-hearted aunt. Mr. Brocklehurst, I mentioned, the lousy supervisor of Lowood. I don't always like Schmoop, but I think that these descriptions are kind of funny. Helen Burns, Jane's saintly best friend, the most angelic of angels. Rochester, kind of like the beast, they said, gets tamed by Jane. Ugly, kind of a jerk. Sort of. I think that's a reductionist view of it. Obviously, this is very short, but I don't think that Rochester is a jerk. I think that he's testing Jane to see what kind of person she is. And also, her station would have made their love forbidden. So, or at least a little bit taboo. So he has to kind of feel things out and see if she's the person she seems to be. Adele, the little French girl. St. John is a character who comes later on. He's a missionary, but not a saint, but he thinks he is. Well, he is. He kind of has an interesting character arc, and I don't want to ruin it for you, but we'll talk about it more later. Yes, he's quite bent on becoming a missionary. And it seems at first like he's giving up a lot of other things in his life to pursue that. But he does feel like it's a calling from God. And if that's the case, then that's the case. And then you have to do things and give things up. So Bessie, I mentioned, Jane's nursemaid as a child. Her cousins growing up, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. Miss Temple, her kind teacher. Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper. Grace Poole, the red-haired seamstress who lives at Thornfield. She seems to be involved in some of the mystery, possibly causing it. Although it seems at times like it might be ghosts, and so it's confusing. People I did not mention, Blanche Ingram is a wealthy and beautiful and selfish girl who is interested in Rochester. So they've kind of also had, it would seem, some type of flirtation where she might want to marry him for all of the wrong reasons. So standing in the way of Jane's affections. Jane also meets St. John. Also, I should say this. His name is spelled St. John, but it's pronounced St. John. A Victorian name we don't often see today. Diana and Mary are St. John's sisters, so those are some of her friends she meets later. And then Rosamond is Jane's friend and St. John's love interest. So it's quite interesting kind of comparing Rosamond to Blanche and seeing some of their similarities and differences. That's something I'd like you to look for. So, read-alikes. So anyway, before we get to read-alikes, yes, there are a number of characters, not all of them are listed here, but this is, for the most part, the main appearances. And sorry, my mic cut out. And yeah, I would just like you to discover them as you go. So hopefully you'll do that. All right, read-alikes. Villette is another story by Charlotte Bronte, which also has some similarities to her life, as does this book. This book follows the author's life quite closely at different parts, and we're going to talk more about that next time with, I think it's 6 things to know about Jane Eyre, but it might be 5. So Villette is another story by Charlotte Bronte, so if you like Jane Eyre, you might like that book as well. Wuthering Heights is by Charlotte's sister Emily, and I actually find it's interesting. I find that people either love Wuthering Heights and feel like kind of meh about Jane Eyre, or they love Jane Eyre and they don't love Wuthering Heights as much. I like both, and I think you might too. But I almost thought about The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall is by Anne Bronte, who is also a sister of Charlotte. So all 3 women wrote novels, and all 3 books are great. Rebecca, depending on what semester you're listening to this, we might be reading Rebecca. We might also be reading Wuthering Heights. Rebecca, I feel, is almost like a retelling of Jane Eyre in some ways, at least. You have a person of kind of a lower station who falls for a wealthier, older man, and there are mysteries in that story as well, and a kind of a gothic tone. So not exactly the same plot, but similar in tone and kind of the setup, right? It's a great book. The Wide Sargasso Sea is a post-colonial retelling of Jane Eyre from a different character's perspective, and it isn't my favorite, but a lot of people do like it, so it is definitely a read-alike, but don't look up that book until after you finish Jane Eyre. Because it does retell the story. So if you look up the plot of that, it'll spoil the plot of this. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen is kind of, it's interesting. I don't know if a lot of people call it Jane Austen's Gothic novel, but really she's kind of making fun of Gothic novels and trying to do kind of a parody of them. So if you have read a lot of Gothic novels, it's kind of funny. Because there are bumps in the night and coincidences and mysteries and all of that sort of thing, but it's quite exaggerated. Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf has some of the same themes about gender expectations. The 13th Tale, I love this book. It's a modern, it's only been written in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years. But it has a lot of the same Gothic elements and just wonderful narration and really rich details. It's a great, great book. And A Little Princess, which I think is sort of similar to Jane's years at school. So if you really enjoyed that part of this novel, the young Jane Eyre section, A Little Princess is a children's book, but also follows a girl who is sent away to school and then what happens to her after that. So those are some read-alikes if you happen to like Jane Eyre, which I hope that you do, and I can't wait to see your thoughts on it. Next time, we're going to talk about some of the things to know about Jane Eyre, the background, of the author as well as some other details. And then after that, we will be diving into the themes. And after that, we'll look at the end. So that's all for now. And if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments.